hello to everyone in Singapore. It's great to be back with you, even if only virtually. It brings back all the memories of our previous conferences, so hello to you. And I'm delighted to be hosting this discussion around the revisions to the OECD G20 principles, because I think that this revision process comes at a very opportune moment. When I think back to 2015, which is when the last revision occurred, how different the world looked then, and how even more different to the world of 1999, which was when we had the very first edition of the OECD Principles. But very interesting to listen to Serda and Sian to discussing some of the ways that they're planning to revise the principles. I mean, from my own perspective, I suppose some of the big issues which I'm looking for the principles to address will be number one will be the fact that people now tend to look at corporate governance as part of a much bigger project, a project which is concerned with climate change, which is concerned with social impact. So very interested to hear whether the panelists think that is going to be sufficient in terms of the revisions that are going to be made. And of course, the other big change since 2015 has just been the change in the global environments, not only in terms of the strains that it placed on the global trading system in the wake of COVID, but also the deterioration in the global geopolitical environment, which, you know, really it is placing the global international trading order under significant strain. So I wonder if our corporate governance can rise to that challenge. But let me introduce, first of all, Professor Mak Wan Teen. Professor Mak, you are Professor of Accounting at NUS Business School. What do you make of the current proposed revisions to the OECD G20 principles?
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all can hear me, and good morning to my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure, and thank you, SIAS, for inviting me to share. I want to just kind of give some historical perspective and then give some views about the current revision. I think when the OECD principles were first issued in 1999, I think it was very timely for this part of the world because in mid-1997, we had the East Asia financial crisis, and weaknesses in corporate governance were identified as one of the key contributing factors. And at that time, no country in this region had a code of governance. In fact, my first trip to Paris was to attend a discussion of the formulation of the first OECD principles. Okay, and then I attended the first OECD roundtable in Seoul, and had attended a few more after that. I remember after that first conference, I came back and spoke to some key stakeholders. I say, Singapore needs to be involved in this conversation of corporate governance at the international level. So I was very pleased when Singapore hosted the third Asian roundtable in 2001, and that's the year when we released our first code of corporate governance, and then the roundtable came back again in 2007. So, and what happened was, in 2011, when we were looking at developing ASEAN corporate governance scorecard, a regional scorecard to look at governance of companies in the region, we were looking for a set of global standards, and we used the OECD principles as a major benchmark. Having said that, I guess while the OECD principles are the only global set of CG principles and have been widely endorsed by both member and non-member countries, and I think they remain useful for countries that are developing or reviewing their corporate governance framework. I think the fact that they aim to be global and are generally non-prescriptive also means that they are kind of more a reference or tool for identifying pertinent issues and possible measures to address them. So to me, the OECD principles for many markets will be more aspirational than a single set of standards to converge to, unlike, for example, what financial reporting or sustainability reporting standards aim to achieve. I think as the preamble to the principles itself acknowledges, individual countries need to consider issues most relevant to their own context when formulating local rules and guidelines. And given the nature being global principles, certain principles or aspects of the principle may be seen to be less relevant to individual countries because the global principles have to accommodate a wide range of legal regimes and institutional environments. And because of different stages of development of capital markets in different countries. But having said that, right, some principles may become more relevant over time. I remember when we look at the first set of principles in 1999, even in 2015, to many countries, including in this region that focuses more on shareholder value, a principle on the role of stakeholders seemed at that time somewhat irrelevant, to some, but how times have changed, right? Because today, even countries that follow the shareholder model are now talking about stakeholder interests. But having said that, of course, the current OECD principles, the role of stakeholders focus more on employees and creditors' interests. So in a sense, I welcome this review and the proposal in the consultation to replace it with a pillar that focuses on the broader theme of sustainability and resilience. I think you have to go beyond the kind of stakeholders that currently are the focus within that particular pillar. I also think it is timely to incorporate sustainability considerations into the other pillars as the proposed revision seeks to achieve. I think all countries, and I was listening to Sayan, and I teach corporate governance and sustainability course to international group of students, and you'll be glad to hear that because it's an international group of students, the benchmark I use is the UK Code of Governance. Okay, because I think it is, even though it's now undergoing revision, I thought even the 2018 version, I think was quite advanced in terms of looking at workforce remuneration and some of those other issues. So I think that what is important is not just to have a separate pillar on sustainability and resilience, but to integrate them. And I think all countries should relook their code of governance and do that. Yes. And I also agree broadly with the 10 priority areas identified for the review. But I would also say that it will probably further the gap, open the gap between the more developed markets and the less developed markets. And even some of the existing principles already, I think that there are certain markets which are still far behind, still not at the level that we aspire to. So basically, I want to kind of conclude my initial comments with two observations or suggestions. One is, I think many countries, and when I say that it may not be popular, I would say including Singapore, and there are certain aspects even with the current principles that we could do better. For example, in terms of effectiveness, transparency, and consistency in regulation and enforcement, in terms of shareholder rights and investor protection, in terms of institutional investors' role and accountability of intermediaries, for example. So while I think it is appropriate to revise the principles to ensure their relevance in light of recent developments, I think we should not lose sight of the fact that some of the foundational elements of good corporate governance remain lacking in many countries, and some may even have regrets. So, I hope while yes, we have to deal with new issues, some old issues have not been addressed too. And the other thing is, as they say sometimes, it's been a long time between innings. So, Roger was talking about the first set of principles in 1999, and then you had 2004, then you had 2015, 11 years. Then you have another 8 years by the time the revised principles come out again. I think it would be useful for OECD to consider whether there is a mechanism you can develop to have more timely kind of updates of certain areas of the principle rather than doing a big review every 8 years or something because the world moves so quickly. So
Yes.
I'm going to stop now, and then I look forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mack. And it's funny that you should mention the 2015 revision process, because as our next speaker, we have Marcello Bianchi. Hello, Marcello. As well as being Deputy Director of ASSONIM, the Association of Italian Joint Stock Companies, I understand that you were the chair of the Corporate Governance Committee that oversaw the 2015 revision. So I wonder what you make of this 2022 revision, or 2023.
Thank you very much to everyone. It's a big pleasure for me to come back to Asia, even virtually, where I was several times when I was chairman of the OECD Corporate Governance Committee, because in several Asian countries we had, as OECD, a very important initiatives trying to contribute to the improvement of corporate governance in this area, as in the other area at global level. For my past experience, obviously, I'm not very neutral about the work of OECD, but let me clearly state that I think that OECD principles are a very relevant policy tool at global level, and still they are. A lot of legislative reforms have been inspired or explicitly based on the OECD principles in the past, not only in emerging economies, but also in more developed economies. I can testify that in Italy, for example, many reforms consider the message of OECD principles as an important basis. And I do think that this is the right moment to address new challenges as the ones linked to sustainability. Because the role, the ongoing role of the OECD principles is to consolidate best practices and to looking forward to address new challenges. And I think that the current revision perfectly fits those criteria, both for topic address and for timing. There is a clear need for an high-level guide to address sustainability challenges. First of all, climate changes, but also the other social linked issues. And I fully agree with the 10 priorities that were identified by OECD to be addressed in the revision and that were presented by Serdar before, because they are key to enhance the fulfillment of the strategic pillars of the OECD principles, also highlighted by Serdar, because as OECD always said, corporate governance is not an end per se, but is a tool to achieve more relevant and important goals. And in this moment, I think that one of the strategic goals of the principle that should be maintained when we look at the sustainability issue is the access to finance, because this is one of the problems that we face. Serdar showed some figures about the reduction of listed companies all around the world, and I would like to underline how continuing to promote access to finance is the best way to help companies and economies to address more substantial economic and social goal. As for the contents of the revision, I have just one comment to send to the OECD friends. In my view, they should give more attention to other tools rather than just the regulatory tools. It's true that the principles are an instrument for policymakers, but in my experience, policymakers are not only legislators, but also other institutions like that use self-regulation. And I refer in particular to the corporate governance codes mentioned by Sir Jan before, that are a very important tool in the area of corporate governance, because they prove to be able to fill the gap between rules and behavior, and they were very important in identifying emerging practices to address to face new challenges. And that was the case also for sustainability. So my suggestion is to include in the principle something explicitly referring to the role of corporate governance code, because in the area of corporate governance, this is an instrument that used to be very, very effective. It is more flexible than just the regulation. This is my first comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcello. Serdar, there's been a lot of discussion about how you are trying to incorporate sustainability considerations into the revisions, and you're really trying to embrace, I suppose, in a way, the whole ESG agenda, which has exploded since 2015. I wonder to what extent you still think it's relevant, or the OECD still thinks it's relevant, to consider corporate governance as a standalone issue. Was there any consideration, for example, given to rebranding the principles of corporate governance as the principles of ESG?
Thank you, Roger. It's an interesting question. Probably many have similar questions in mind. So how we see the principles of the committee, OECD, G20 countries? Again, I mean, as Marcel also described well, and also Sir Jan Duplessis and Professor Teen, I mean, they are high-level instrument for OECD, G20, FSP, and more other countries to implement them in their national framework now. So the way we see it is what we have in the principles, the current principles, is all about G. So if you look at the index providers, if you look at ratings, if you look at any ESG metrics in the world now, everything around G is already in the principles. I mean, there is almost nothing, and it has already provided a global framework how to regulate G. So now the issue is, how do we integrate E and S to this G framework? And as mentioned, there are multiple options to do this, but at least there are two main ones. One is to have this core G function and then integrate different elements on E and environmental and social issues in different parts of the current principles, or the alternative approach, so far what we are proposing and which is in the draft made public, having a separate chapter and using the current core principles that we have agreed, and as Professor Teen said, is not fully implemented everywhere in the world, but still there is a huge consensus. And the really good thing about this global consensus, there was a huge convergence among OECD, non-OECD G20 countries on understanding of what is good governance, what is the good G. And what we are trying to do is, okay, since there is a good convergence, and which we are monitoring with the OECD Corporate Governance Factbook, which we see a change really. Over the years, we see change everywhere in the G. Let's have that core principles of G and implement them a bit of a special case of E and S, which is sustainability, in a separate chapter. So not changing, because again, there is a consensus on the core principles and there is kind of no appetite to change the core principles in that sense, but implement them in a very important, especially climate, but in general, E and S issues to the core principles in a separate chapter, a bit of a special case study of the time. So I think that is the approach what we are saying. So we believe that it is on the G side, as Marcello said, they are very strong, and there is a kind of, they are accepted around the world, and they give us a good foundations to address the new challenges, which is E and S challenges. I mean, you know, in general, I mean, there is less how can I say, maybe I can say easily, like there's less momentum on the ES dimension, no? But there's a huge momentum on the E dimension, especially from the climate, from investors. I mean, the comments we receive from the investment side, from stakeholders, the big momentum is on the E side. So, and this is a very, very relevant topic. Let's use this momentum and how to then see how can we kind of implement our core principles to this changing environment. I think that's basically the approach we have now.
Yes, and Marcelo, do you agree with that approach to address ESG?
Yeah, definitely. I fully agree that the main focus of the OECD principle should be corporate governance, because I do think that corporate governance, as I said before, it cannot be considered an end per se like the others, but it's an instrument, and it's a very important instrument in perceiving other goals, economic growth, but also social and environmental balance and improvement. Obviously, the corporate governance that model that should be offered by the OECD is, I would say, an enlightened model of corporate governance, where the sustainability issues are considered a natural and an integral part of corporate governance tools, because they affect all the traditional corporate governance tools that, not by case, are the chapters of the OECD principles, the role of the board, disclosure and transparency, but also the so-called external tools of corporate governance, like the regulatory and institutional framework, the role of intermediaries, the relationship with stakeholders. So I strongly believe that the focus should be maintained on corporate governance. What I would suggest to the OECD is not to add a new chapter on sustainability in the principles, but rather trying to split sustainability within the traditional chapter. That this could be the idea that sustainability not something that would be added to corporate governance traditional tools, but is something that would give a new life to the traditional ones. Then yes. I understand that from a communication point of view, it would be useful to have a new chapter in order to raise the attention. But in my view, it would be more important to introduce, but I'm sure that they will do that, to include within any line, if you want, of the current principles, this new sustainability sensitivity.
Yes, so Jan, I could see you nodding your head, so I take it you agree with Marcelo.
Roger, may I just speak? I would like to strongly agree with Marcelo. To me, the way I think about this, governance is like the constitutional document of an organization, like the constitution of a country. It's the basis where everything starts. That is where you look at the board of directors, the board committees, and their supervision of executive management. So I strongly believe one should not divorce environmental factors and social considerations from the company's strategy and all the other things the company is trying to pursue. So I think for me, proper governance of social and environmental issues and climate change issues should be integrated into the overall strategy, the financial health, risk management of the organization, which hangs underneath governance. I think the moment one puts it in a separate box, it's as if to say you can divorce it from business. And in my opinion, a progressive, modern, successful organization will understand the need to incorporate social and environmental factors successfully in its business model and in its strategies.
Thank you, Jan. Professor Mack, I wonder if I could just turn to a slightly different topic. Serdar made a couple of what I thought were very interesting observations in his presentation. He emphasized the fact that the number of listed companies globally is in significant decline, very significantly compared to the late 90s. But he also observed that during the pandemic, existing listed companies were able to tap into capital markets very effectively in order to buttress their financial position, although there weren't many new companies coming to either equity or debt markets. So my question for you is, do you think that we can do anything about this? I mean, can changes to the OECD principles or other regulation reverse these trends? And do these trends actually even matter?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is that in many markets, right, most of the companies listed are SMEs, and which is also the point that, the OECD principles in a sense is kind of very high, very aspirational, as I say. And if individual countries kind of use the OECD principles to set their local corporate governance rules, they'll probably have even more companies kind of leaving the market. So, I think therefore, it's actually useful. And in some countries have started doing it, like Malaysia, are there certain things that maybe we should just focus on that SMEs should have, smaller companies, and then there are certain things which larger companies should have. So, I think what are the foundational elements that may hopefully reverse some of that. And the other thing I think needs to be talked about, and UK has done that with the weights principle. I think increasingly we need to level the playing field a little bit between listed and unlisted companies, because you think about this whole issue of ESG, right? I mean, if only the listed companies have to do all those things, after a while, you have even more companies saying that we're not going to list. So I think that at the end of the day, we have to now think about raising the bar for the unlisted companies, and that may reverse some of these tendencies to delist. And I think, on this issue of secondary fundraising, I mean, maybe those companies which are talking about, all the compliance issues being onerous and so they discovered during the pandemic, it's not a bad thing to be a listed company, because you can actually access equity, right, to secondary, fundraising and so on, which you may not have if you're not a listed company. So that's where I'm coming from. I think we maybe need to think about the leveling the playing field between the unlisted sector and the listed sector.
Yes. So Jan, I wonder if you'd agree with that, because in the UK, we are taking a number of steps to try and address the decline in the number of listed companies. And as Professor Max said, we now have a set of principles for unlisted, corporate governance principles for unlisted companies. What do you think that regulation and codes of conduct and so on can do to address these issues?
Roger, thank you. You're very kind to give me an opportunity to talk about something I feel really important, really strongly about. Look, the trend of companies moving from public markets into private markets has been discussed today by Seda and Marcello as well. So it's a global trend. And there are many reasons, there are a number of factors behind that, too complicated for this morning's conversation. However, I strongly believe that in the UK, the government adopted years ago what's called Section 172 of the Companies Act, which is an attempt to ensure that boards of directors will consider other stakeholders, the environment, employees, pensioners, and so on, a wider range of stakeholders other than the narrow interests of shareholders. I think it's a well-intended piece of legislation. It doesn't always really work. I think it only really works if a board of directors says, well, the interests of wider stakeholders, if we look after their interests, we will look after the interests of our shareholders. But the UK recently changed the definition of what we call a public interest entity, which is therefore an entity which is subject to a number of the things we're discussing today, to begin to bring in more private companies. And I would leave us this morning with this really important thought. If we all believe that societies that we live in demand from regulators and governments greater accountability by boards of directors for things other than purely shareholder returns, such as the environment, such as employees, such as pensioners, suppliers, and other things, then I do believe it will be right to bring into the ambit of some of these obligations also private companies. I do not understand and I do not accept that there's any logic in society as a whole wanting to hold to account only publicly quoted companies rather than some very large privately held companies. I think it's a mistake, and I think it's a challenge that across the world we should begin to address. Otherwise, capitalism will over time simply increasingly go down in the estimation of so many members of society who are otherwise a bit skeptical.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes remaining, and what I would like to ask to each of the panelists is this question. Will the OECD G20 principles, do you think, be as relevant to business in 2030 as they have been in recent years? And what advice can we give to the OECD to try and ensure that their impact is maximized in the coming years? Marcelo, I wonder if I could start with you.
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, I hope so, but I think that in order to maintain their relevance, the issue we were discussing before should be addressed. So the decline of public markets, capital markets. I do think that in particular sustainability requires capital markets, because in order to be more sustainable, companies should address a so huge amount of investments that only strong capital markets can support. And I fully agree with Sir Jan that we have to create a level playing field between private and public companies. And I would say, on the contrary, we should encourage companies to become public, because without the support of capital markets, probably they will not be able to be sustainable in the long term. So this is the challenge for our economies and even for corporate governance per se, and so for the OECD principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo. And so, Professor Mack, how can the OECD continue to maximize the influence of the principles?
You know, I'm kind of reflecting the last time we held the OECD roundtable in Singapore is 2007, and kind of I kind of say over time, has there been a loss of momentum in terms of certain countries, right? Some of the more developed, some of the markets thinking that maybe the OECD principles have become too aspirational, because in many of our markets, I mean, if you look at just the Singapore market, right, most of our companies are SMEs, those that are listed. So, is it an adequate basis for us to set our corporate governance rules? Maybe, as I mentioned just now, some thought to focusing on kind of SMEs, what are most important for SMEs and so on, and then kind of higher level standards, right, for other companies. That may be a way, and some countries have started doing that, like Malaysia, right? So I think for that to be, I think for the OECD principles to be relevant, I think there has to be a fairly realistic kind of standard or watermark that is set. Yeah.
Yes. So Jan, I suppose that this consideration of the OECD principles is part of a broader concern. How do we maintain the influence of soft law, things like the UK Corporate Governance Code and the Stewardship Code? Yes,
can I say firstly, Roger, that look, I have the greatest admiration for the OECD principles. I think they've been very important, they've been very influential, and I'm very, very supportive of the current initiative to bring them up to date. But I think we all recognize that by its nature, they are global principles. They've got such a number of different situations, countries in which they've got to apply, that by their very nature, it's a kind of an averaging process. And I think the one comment which I think Marcelo made today, which I really want to endorse, is that can we think of encouraging through the OECD principles the adoption of much more specific, may I say, more demanding corporate governance codes on a country-by-country basis, in a manner that is appropriate to that country, and that is not to downplay the importance of the principles, it's just to recognize that the principles can only have, to have global application, they need to be general. I will make one final thought, and that is, in the UK yesterday, we are celebrating this year the 30th anniversary of our corporate governance code, which I think was probably the first in the world in 1992. We called it the Cadbury Code. Now, the reason the code is relevant, it has been changed and evolved over time. It always stays current. I'm not recommending a permanent process of change, but you've got to stay current. And a number of the things, Roger, that we did in 1992 in the first so-called Cadbury Code, we've taken out of the code because it's become obvious, it's become part of business practice, other things have become more demanding. So the principles need to be constantly reviewed, they need to stay current and relevant to people's lives on a daily basis.
Thank you, Sayan. So, Serdar, we've run out of time, but I hope the panelists have offered you some useful advice for your for the initiative going forward. I'll leave you with the last word.
Thank you, Roger. It was really extremely useful. I mean, of course, we have discussed about many developments, declining number of listed companies, ownership concentration, risk, and these are all important things. But one thing really, this revision and the principles are probably more important than ever, is the increase in cross-border equity investments. This has been a very, very strong trend. Now, in even countries traditionally very domestic market, there is 30–40% foreign investment in the market. So there is a stronger need for a global consensus, at least at the baseline level. What is good corporate governance? First, public policy, and then what should companies do? And I think what the aim of the OECD and the G20 now is really to a bit kind of increase the threshold, because based on an already agreed global consensus, to show what is the expectations from public policymakers to increase the global corporate governance practices and standards. Thank you very much, everyone. It was extremely useful in terms of really comments, and we will, of course, I have taken very careful note of all the comments on the revisions, and of course, we will definitely discuss in the OECD and reflect them in our work going forward.
Thank you, everyone.